Hi everyone, and welcome to a new episode of It's Just Feminism, where we try to answer some simple yet complicated questions like what is feminism, who are feminists, what do feminists do, and can feminism actually change the world? Well, the guest of this series will show you by example that not only does feminism have potential to change the world, they're actively doing it. My name is Aurora, I'll be your host, and joining me today is Neil to talk about his dual life as a professor and a digital content creator who stitches the content made by the manosphere. If you enjoyed watching this episode, make sure to leave a like and maybe even subscribe so you miss on any future episode. And also, I just want to remind you that this is a safe space, so any type of hate or violence will not be tolerated, but you're more than welcome to share your own opinions, thoughts, experiences, your favorite comic book heroes, and similar. Thank you, Neil, for being here today, and let's dive right into it. For start, let's talk about your teaching career. How did you get into teaching? What are some of the unique challenges that teaching presents? And what are some occasions when your students inspired you with their own ideas and the work that they do?
How did I get onto this teaching track? I always knew from the time that I was an undergraduate student that I wanted to go to grad school, that I wanted to teach in a college or a university. Um, so there, I don't know that there was a particular moment where I made that decision because at least as far back as my memory goes, this was always what I had wanted to do. Which doesn't mean that it has been a linear journey or without obstacles. I've been lucky in that I think that the time that I spent in sort of that nebulous in between liminal space um, during graduate school up until the point that I landed my current job, which is permanent. It's the Ontario college system doesn't have something that they call the tenure track, but it is effectively that. Um, that in between period was short for me. It was really only a few years where I was bouncing around with sectional work. I got lucky again in that the contract work that I was able to find, which was at the University of Toronto in their engineering communication program. Um, they really like to keep the people who work there on a contract basis happy. And so if that means giving you 4 courses, because then you won't have the time to go somewhere else either. You're not going to be burdened with worrying about other schools and other contracts, and they'll do that for you. So even my contract experience, I think was pretty remarkable for that fact. In terms of times where students have inspired me, I've again been lucky to work with some pretty remarkable students. I spent a few years teaching English for Academic Purposes, which is the English as a Second Language courses that are geared specifically towards students entering college and university, and got to meet a lot of wonderful people with some pretty remarkable stories. I'm trying to think of like, can I even uh, select somebody in particular? There were a number of students who, for a variety of reasons, um, left their country and came to Canada because they were never going to have the opportunity to study what they wanted to study. Much less work in the profession or even the field that they wanted to work in. To take that monumental step, to cross oceans, because they felt that powerfully compelled. That is pretty amazing. And in those classrooms, that could describe half of the students that I was teaching. I even had one time it was a mother-son combination. She realized, without getting into identifying details, her son wanted to be a medical doctor and never would be. And so she's like, okay, then this is what we need to do. We are going to uproot our family. We are going to go to Canada, and you're going to get your shot. Sort of strange, funny postscript to that story was that that is not at all what happened. And now he's an actor.
Interesting.
I'm not sure that you could head in a more opposite trajectory.
Yeah.
That's where he landed. Um, but even more generally speaking, students surprise me in both the best and the worst ways routinely. I've been at this long enough now um, that I've either bumped into students a decade later in some cases, uh, or I've sort of loosely kept touch with them all along and had the opportunity to follow their life's trajectory. I can't say that I know, of course, how anything is going to turn out, but at least at this point in time, to see so many of them successful and thriving and happy is also wonderful because it especially in those moments where we all have those days where we wonder why we chose this work and it seems just difficult and there are always cases that provide us with reasons to feel cynical or pessimistic, so it's great to have these reminders uh, that we're doing work that matters and makes a difference and is helping to achieve some really meaningful outcomes.
Yeah, I love that.
There's something really wonderful about being able to see the progress, see where students end up, um, whether that's just because of a chance encounter or an email that arrives years later, or in a couple of cases, I've kept touch with a few students to see that we have had some sort of meaningful positive impact, because there are days where it feels like we're kind of bashing our heads against the wall. So we need that reminder that like, oh no, this is leading somewhere. This is having some effect, accomplishing some measure of change.
What surprised me the most with Canadian relationships between the professors and the students is how much more personal it is. Like professors actually take interest into many students' lives, and they actually want to hear what students have to say, and they encourage them and things like that. It's a very mutual growing relationship. And back home in Europe, it was mostly hierarchy. So you would have the professor who knows it all, or not even them. God knows it all. The professor knows for the B, and then the most you can get is a C, right? And so that's weird. And you have to use the royal you when speaking to the professors, and not speak with them on personal first names, which is honestly so weird to me. It's kind of hard for me when I'm grading students' work. Is on one side they have issues with grammar, with sentence structure, with some like basic stuff, but on the other hand their ideas, the problems that I see in the society, the ways they try to solve those problems are so unique and so advanced. So it's very interesting to me how Canadian students are so advanced in some ways, and then on some other ways they're lacking. I don't want to use that word, but like they need more training or practice in some stuff.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm pretty certain that a lot of this is attributable to the sort of writing that they are doing on a regular, everyday basis, right? Either blame or credit can be given to phones, to social media, and then that method of communication becomes second nature to them. And it bleeds into the academic work too. I remember there being a point where I recognized that a student was using a lot of the acronyms and shorthand, a lot of internet speak in an essay, and this would have been very early in my career as a TA. It took me aback at first. Now it does feel quite normal. I'm far more likely to be surprised if somebody is writing uh, in what you know, it's always a little bit awkward when we're talking about 18, 19-year-olds when they're trying to find that academic scholarly voice. And it doesn't quite fit. It feels like the written equivalent of a child trying on their parents' clothes.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
It's endearing in the same way because I'm like, oh wow, you're going for it, and I really appreciate that. But at the same time, there's a level of honesty and authenticity to that that internet speak that I can also appreciate. And you're right, it does seem a little jarring sometimes to see that paired with really advanced thought, which I feel like I've spent enough time on the internet now and in these spaces to recognize that for a lot of them, that isn't an odd juxtaposition. And in fact, they're probably sharing it in the same language that they were exposed to these thoughts in the first place, because they're probably also learning about them in spaces like TikTok, on Reddit. So to them, like, oh no, this is how I encountered it in nature too. It's totally normal.
Yeah.
But being on the wrong side of 40, it does strike me as a little strange sometimes too.
I mean, at least they make it easier for us to detect AI generated text. Because if you ask the AI to write you an essay on, you know, popular culture, on the impact of Barbie on masculinity in 2023 or something like that, you will see that faux text, and then you will see something that's written like TikTok rant, and then you're like, okay, yeah, this seems more genuine.
I think that is true in 90% of the cases, but one of my colleagues recently walked us through in a meeting um, the process by which one of his students wrote and submitted an essay. And he had written this student up for plagiarism. And so brought the student in for the meeting that's mandated by our academic policies and just said, can you show me how you wrote this? And he was thinking, she'll never be able to do it. Like this is obviously academic dishonesty. And what she did was sat down at her laptop, typed something out, and he's saying like the grammar is terrible, the spelling is non-existent. I can't even really follow the train of thought. But then what she did was each of our students is given free access to Grammarly to help with their writing. And so she opened up Grammarly, and one by one, each sentence just accepted every correction that Grammarly gave her. And at the end, it spit out something that was quite different from what she had written. Um, but he was like, this looks remarkably like what she turned in. And here she is saying like, look, I used the tools that you gave me. What did I do wrong? And he's like, you know what? That's an excellent question because we didn't intend for you to have Grammarly um, edit to this extent. And yet, like, I don't know that I can point to any individual thing that you did wrong. So now it's not even necessarily that AI is generating something from a prompt. It could just be you know effectively rewriting what the students themselves have written to such a degree. It's like a ship of Theseus in written form, right? Is it still the same essay, even though we've gone through and replaced every wooden plank?
Yeah.
Which I didn't expect that kind of philosophy question to emerge from all of this.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, I use Grammarly, not gonna lie, as an international student trying
Sure.
to figure out writing in English. Sometimes I need some advice, I guess, but I try to limit it to certain issues when I see that I'm stuck. When I see that I can't figure out the sentence, and I just say it or write it in how I would phrase it in my own language, but in English. And then Grammarly will say, oh, no, no, you should put this comma here, you should put this in this way, and that helps. But yeah, there is a thin line between using Grammarly and AI as a tool, like a calculator, or using it to do your work instead of you, which is the same as paying somebody to write your essay, which is wrong. This whole internet drama brings us to my second question, and that is, how did you get into social commentary on social media, and how did that then turn into your famous hit me with it stitches that you do on the manosphere?
This is sort of a funny story. I started using TikTok in early 2021. And the reason was that I was teaching an online course about graphic novels. And I had all of this wonderful material that I was generating, and I was sharing with my class of 20 students. And I thought, there's got to be a broader, wider appeal for this sort of stuff. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start a TikTok account, and I'm just going to share some of the material that I share with my class. So it began as a way for me to talk about graphic novels and comic books, to talk about what we were discussing in class that week. And then it grew from there, became a little more eclectic. I think, unsurprisingly, the sort of perspectives and the politics that I brought to that graphic novel class were very progressive, broadly speaking, feminist, anti-racist. I signed a book that was a critique of the carceral state and prisons, right? Another one, the March series about Martin Luther King. So very politicized graphic novels that sort of drew me in other directions in these social media spaces too. So I ended up shifting my attention from sort of these literary politics um, to the much more apparent, real politics of the manosphere. For instance, over a period of about a year, it wasn't a sudden transition by any means, though I do remember there being a point where I realized, hey, I don't think I've spoken about comic books or graphic novels or superheroes for an entire week. And I have always had little other side niches that I operate in as well. Whether that's talking about academia, talking about labor in general. I'm the president of the faculty union at my college, so union work and labor politics have always been there too. Sports, especially, the question of gender in sports is something that I've always dipped my toe in as well. So it wasn't I don't think it was a jarring switch for anybody that was following me. But yeah, at some point, it became very normal for me to structure my videos as responses. Often to men operating in the manosphere, sometimes to women operating there as well. A lot of dating coaches, and honestly, it was because it was fun. Is very satisfying to do, um, especially because they are so bad at it.
I love this.
The claims are just completely unsupported, or when they attempt to do their own research, um, they understand what they are reading so poorly. One of my favorites was a podcaster named Chris Williamson. He's not even close to being one of the worst. And in fact, there are some episodes he has made that I've watched parts of. I've never been able to sit through an entire episode. But there are parts where, in fact, the discussion is good. He's had like actual academics as guests on his show. But he himself, when he tries to do research, just does it routinely poorly. And so in this one instance, he was talking about this research that no one pays attention to, this study that says in order for men to feel happy, they need to have 2 nights of the week either to themselves or to spend with their friends. None of the pressures of home or a partner or children. And he mentioned the name of the researcher, and that was enough for me to be able to track down this study. So I'm like, write their name, and I'm like, men 2 nights a week. Let's see what we can find. So I found the study, and it was so first of all, it was a qualitative study, which not necessarily bad. I love qualitative work myself, so long as like we are very aware of the limits. And it was a qualitative study of 6 people. It was performed over the course of one night at a bar, and it was sponsored by Heineken.
Gee, I wonder how did they structure the whole thing then.
It was published on Heineken's website.
Oh, so it wasn't even published in a scientific journal or anything.
So the only thing that to recommend it as being a study was the fact that it was a sociologist who was commissioned to hang out with some guys at a bar over one night and then write about the importance of spending time with your buddies, drinking, and Heineken paid for all of it. And I'm like, you left that out of the podcast. That wasn't mentioned anywhere. Did you even realize that this is what was going on? Can I trust anything that you have to say now? It's very fun to make those kinds of videos, but it's also useful. It's I like the opportunity, even though it's you know what I call it. It's work. Would I call it scholarship? No.
Public outreach, let's say.
Yeah, I think that calling it something like outreach, I'm not sure what word we would choose to use, is tremendously useful. To show the quality of the work of the people who are making these claims, simultaneously then to redirect people to work that has more legitimacy, that has more to offer them. And I have gotten a number of messages now over the past 2 years, often from men who say that they appreciate that I have debunked something that in some cases they thought to be true, or that maybe they had questions about. It didn't sit quite right with them, and then I was able to either articulate something or direct them toward something they could read that said otherwise, as well as messages from women who either share these videos with their partners or with their children in some cases. And really that's the sort of response that keeps me going sometimes, to know that sort of positive impact is being felt somewhere, because there are days where it feels like a whole lot of work for something that professionally is not valued all that much. I think this is still seen as sort of a sideshow by most people in academia. It can consume a lot of time and energy. There are certainly moments where I wonder, like, would that time and energy be better spent working on something else? But I mean, the reach that one can have on TikTok or Instagram, I could spend how many hours working on a journal article that 50 people will read? The reach is a little more limited.
On Instagram alone, you have more than 200,000 people who are tuning in into your stitches and learning from you. So I think that it's important work. It's not academia in its ivory tower, but it's still work. It's sharing knowledge. It's sharing ideas. It's teaching people how to think for themselves on certain issues and
Sure.
to research for themselves, because research is a skill that we can develop. It's not something we're born with. It's not like anybody who is a PhD was born with all of the skill sets for literature review and everything else. Like
Yeah.
you learn along the way. And I believe there is value in sharing that work that we do with the public, because why else are we doing it? Somebody has to read that work or find it or think about it. Otherwise, we are wasting our times just writing something for 5 people who's going to read it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, if the shoe were on the other foot, if I were not um, running these social media accounts, I would hope that I would be happy to see somebody doing this work and maybe sharing my study that, you know, again, a couple dozen people have read, and now I have the opportunity for it to be shared with a much wider audience, an audience that would never otherwise find it. That that would be pretty incredible, I think.
Yeah, but there is again that other side of that coin of social media. For every beautiful message that you get, for every encouraging comment that you read under your posts, you get
Mhm.
1 to 5, depending on the type of the post that you make, of people who feel triggered or called out, whose ego
Mhm.
starts to react because they're rethinking their whole lives because you just told them something that they took as granted, as a value, something that they were taught that is a way of living, a way the world works.
Mhm.
And then you come in and say to them, no, 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 actually, you're not a bigger man if your wife is scared of you or something like that. And they're like, wait, what? Like, what do you mean the bear is better?
Yes. Yeah, you're right.
How do you deal with it?
There's no good answer to this question because a lot of the time, the way that you deal with it um, is to avoid or ignore it. I will get over the course of a day, hundreds, if not thousands, of comments over the three different platforms that I post to, because I cross post everything. So first of all, even if they're all good, it's impossible to keep up with. Um, and given that, I made a decision at some point that 99% of the negative feedback, um, I'm going to just breeze by it. I'm not going to acknowledge it, in part because I don't want to reinforce that sort of behavior. I don't want um, people who leave hateful comments to recognize that I interact with them, because that will only invite more. And I don't want people who see positive comments to see me spending my time with the haters rather than responding to people who have something nice to say. But also just, for my own mental health, my own well-being. Um, like I have a rule. I'm also stitched or remixed frequently by the people that I am stitching and remixing, and I just don't watch their videos. If there's something particularly interesting or scary for that matter, I have friends who will sometimes point it out to me to be like, oh, I think that maybe you should take a look at this. But otherwise, I just pretend it's not there. Just don't interact with them. Also, because I don't want to get into these back and forths that you sometimes see um, on TikTok, on Instagram Reels, where people are just arguing in this asynchronous format that, first of all, is painful to experience. Because now, in order to understand, I have to go back to this video, and well, that video doesn't really make sense unless I have the context supplied by this prior video. Um, so it's an awful format for a debate. That is not the sort of experience that I want to have as somebody who makes these videos as well. So yeah, it's unfortunately the answer to a significant degree is just ignore it and pretend it's not happening. because I think the alternative would be to risk starting to believe what people have to say, right? Especially because I don't think it would be surprising to hear that, like, in a day that could be dozens or hundreds of messages. And even if we know that most, if not all, of what they have to say is unfair or inaccurate, it gets to you.
Yeah, I believe. I mean, honestly, that's one of the things that scares me with this whole project, It's Just Feminism, because at the beginning, at the end of every episode, I once again remind people that it's a safe space, that no violence or hate speech is not tolerated, because I don't believe it's fair for people who seek content like this to learn, to grow, to then be faced with some horrible, horrible things in the comment section when they scroll down. So I want to protect them. But on the other hand, there's that issue of free speech and censorship and valuing other people's opinions, but there is that line that we shouldn't cross, and that is respect. I'm sure that it's going to be a learning curve, to say the least, to figure out how to moderate the comments under this. But hopefully, people will realize that, you know, debate is great, conversation is great, dialogue is amazing, but whenever somebody believes they have all the answers, or their way must be the better way because that's the way it's been for hundreds of years.
Like, I wish I could suggest a fix here, right? That I had something that I could recommend. Honestly, the best course of action that I can recommend is don't read them. And I will say that to people sometimes who are clearly, they're looking for a fight. And I have responded, you can write whatever you want, as long as it doesn't cross a line into being explicitly threatening. I'm not going to delete it, but I'm also not going to read it. I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to respond. Doesn't always go over well, but still, it's the boundary that I'm setting for myself, honestly.
Yeah, it's your space.
Mhm. And that it's sometimes dissatisfying, of course, for the people who are looking for that fight. But I've also interacted with people who want a safe space, who also find that to be an unsatisfying line to draw. And I had a very interesting exchange of messages with somebody who felt that I should be making my comment section safer, that I should be deleting and blocking people with much greater frequency than I do. And I said, well, look, frankly, I don't have the time or the ability to do all of that. And I also have to think of myself and how much stress I would also be taking on if I were actually reading all of these to make that determination. And instead, what I do is, I read the first few words and I'm like, oh, this is hostile. Scroll on. And this person was very understanding, and they're like, oh yeah, I can see why that would be difficult for you. But just to let you know, I am never reading your comments again. I am never going to leave a comment because it's too tough for me. And I'm like, that boundary also makes perfect sense. Like, so we're both a little dissatisfied with the situation.
It's a compromise.
It is a compromise, but it's a compromise where nobody is particularly happy, but all of the other options somehow seem to be worse.
Yeah, I mean, you can turn off all of the comments, but then you have no interactions with the people that you're actually doing the content for, so it makes no sense to do that.
Sometimes there is simply no good options available, and we're stuck with trying to take the one that we've determined is the least bad.
Well, I hope that both in your comment section and my comment section, people will choose to be kind and respectful of each other and listen to each other, what they have to say. Um, But because you said that you used to write a lot of content on comic books, on X-Men specifically, so I want to give you an opportunity to once again rant about it, because I believe that you're very passionate about it. So recently we had this controversy about X-Men. Some called X-Men too woke, some said X-Men has been woke since the beginning, and some like you say that there are some issues with X-Men considering the language that they use and the way that they put specific sides against each other, which reinforces the ideology of supremacy and things like that instead of dismantling that type of behavior. So, what are your two coins right now on that?
Oh wow, this is this could be a very long conversation. Well, we can get back to that conversation, that question about, were the X-Men made woke? Were they always woke? Because this actually, I made a video about this recently, and a friend responded to it to say that he thought that even though my response was correct, that it was counterproductive. And so what I said, the way I weighed into this discussion was to say, um, neither the X-Men have become woke or the X-Men were always woke. People are, like, strictly speaking, correct. Um, so I've done, plenty of work on the X-Men, published a couple of papers on the X-Men. I have a book that I've been working on forever. Um, uh, but the X-Men of the 1960s were not particularly political in any way, and despite sort of the superficial trappings of it being politically progressive because the X-Men and mutants are a minority, those issues weren't written about in any particularly thoughtful manner, and that's pretty clear from contemporary coverage and comments that Stan Lee, as the writer and the publisher, was making at the time. And there was a bit of a shift toward the late 1960s, well after Stan Lee was involved in the book, where the writer Roy Thomas was clearly starting to play with a civil rights allegory. And then the X-Men were canceled for several years, and that went nowhere. But it truly isn't until the early 1980s, and this nearly a decade into the work of Chris Claremont on the X-Men, that they actually became overtly political. It was very standard superhero stuff for more than 15 years. Um, so unfortunately, the people who suggest that the X-Men were not always woke are technically correct. Mutant politics didn't become a metaphor for anything else until around like 1980, when suddenly this writer is like, you know what? I can draw out allegories with the Holocaust, for instance. Like, all that said, for the lives, or at least the living memory of most people who are fans of the X-Men now, the X-Men have been woke. For my entire lifespan, they have been explicitly politically progressive, which is not to say that those politics have always been written well. And in fact, most of the time, the X-Men has been in the hands of straight white men who don't actually know what they are talking about or what they are writing about. There's one particular moment. There was a comic book called The Uncanny Avengers. It was a team that meshed together the X-Men and the Avengers. And one of the X-Men says that he doesn't want to be called a mutant anymore. That doesn't define him. And a journalist says, "Well, what do you want us to call you?" He's like, "Call me Alex, because that's my name." Oh my God. Like, what? Like, this is some of the most, like, liberal post-racial, undeniably like straight white dude takes on political activism that I think I have ever seen. And you put it in the mouth of one of the X-Men, saying like, "Oh, I don't see color. I just think of us all as human beings." Understandably, that comic book did not go over well with many fans of the X-Men. And yet Marvel Comics would do these things repeatedly. You know, they would never learn from these mistakes. There's a point where, again, what, 20, almost 20 years ago, um, they reduced the number of mutants in the Marvel universe to 198. You know, there's comic book shenanigans, and suddenly there are only 198 left. And the editorial explanation was, oh, well, there were too many of them for readers to seriously believe that they were an oppressed minority. I'm like,
Wait, what?
wow, yeah. So does that mean that it's not believable that women are oppressed under patriarchy?
Or the people of the global south?
Absolutely. You know, that in fact, a minority of people could have the majority of wealth and power and access to the powers of the state, to policing, to the military. Could there be just one person in the room who has any understanding of politics before you say something that sounds just so wildly uninformed and out of touch? The actual politics of X-Men stories have been a giant mess, you know, this entire time. There's actually a very interesting period of time recently, uh, which they've just wrapped up, and now there's a new status quo in the X-Men comic books. But for 6 years, uh, they had their own nation, you know, and all mutants had the right to claim citizenship there. And in fact, they were using their superpowers to become the world's only superpower state. So it was incredibly disruptive to global politics in this way that was very interesting. They sort of marketed themselves as a benevolent superpower that was willing to share these technologies that they were able to create. Though, of course, there was a bit of a cynical twist to it, which was, oh, we have the ability to share this life-saving technology that we've developed, um, but it comes at a cost, you know, and so that cost being um, official recognition of our sovereignty. This was like not just small p political ideological stuff, but here they were commenting on the state of global politics. You know, the quid pro quo that so many states operate under. And even though they are, you know, the good guys and we want to root for them, they're playing the same game that everyone else does. And is very fascinating period in the comic books, which of course, owing to the nature of how comic book stories are told, could not be allowed to persist. But certainly one of the most interesting um, eras that they've had, and you know, one of the few that felt like it really like delved into, you know, real politics.
Yeah, so sometimes they're subtle and you have to do your reading of it, let's say. So if you have certain beliefs, depending on your positionality and your experiences, you might read into comic books with some specific ideas. Other times they're more blatantly open with the stuff.
Sure.
I think it depends on what they think they can get away with. So, depending on the
Yeah.
cultural climate and the political events that are happening at the moment when they are creating those comics. I mean, comics are never created like any other art in vacuum. It's always in reaction to something that's happening. So, you always have to take into consideration the time when it was written and what was happening and what was like the global opinion, let's say, or the public opinion on certain issues. So I think that currently now with the X-Men of 2024, it's the same thing, I believe. But I want to ask you, I'm not sure if Deadpool counts as an X-Men or not, but considering that he's played by a Canadian sweetheart, I believe we must speak about him. How do you see Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool or Pedro Pascal's Last of Us and similar? Do you see them as a prototype of some new type of masculinity, or is it just a reimagination of something that already was?
Um, I don't I don't know that I would necessarily describe either character as something new. Um, because they're both very much from that mold of the rugged individualist, who has been like a stock character in literature and in movies for I don't even know how long we could trace that lineage back. Um, but certainly in their more recent iterations, the kind of character that would be played by a Clint Eastwood or an Arnold Schwarzenegger type, where it's they are completely self-reliant and tough as nails. Um, Wolverine is an excellent example of that kind of character too. Um, Now, where there might be some newness to them is that they are a little softer than the archetype, which is not to say that the sort of that archetype doesn't allow for a certain kind of softness. Like even a character like Wolverine, it's typical in stories to have him matched with a young woman who is a sort of daughter to him. Wolverine is constantly playing the role of father figure to oftentimes an orphan girl, or at least a girl lacking the presence of her parents, um, who he teaches to be like him, to also be self-sufficient and a rugged individualist, a fighter in a lot of cases. And we see that in The Last of Us with Pedro Pascal's character. Even Deadpool, they sort of they play with that a little bit with his relationship with Negasonic Teenage Warhead, but also play it a little bit for laughs because I think Ryan Reynolds knows that you got to be able to poke fun at these conventions, um, which is also why Deadpool has an ironic relationship to many of the features of that trope or of that genre. What I like about characters like Deadpool then is that it shows a willingness to be able to expand a little bit from that container. And because it's been so successful, it's demonstrated that there's clearly an audience for that kind of thing. It's one of the reasons that I'm very curious about the Deadpool and Wolverine movie, uh, because you have it is very much the case that one is the antecedent to the other. Deadpool has descended from the model created by Wolverine. Um, so like I would imagine that they're going to comment on that to some degree, whether it's explicit or implicit, uh, because Deadpool has sort of picked up a torch. Ryan Reynolds' character appeared around the time that Hugh Jackman's character was wrapping up his arc, and now he's like plucked him. I have to think that they're going to do something interesting with that. Whereas I do think that I wish I'm blanking on the name of Pedro Pascal's character in The Last of Us now. I think that he's a little bit more of a traditional take on that kind of character, um, because these vigilantes are frequently also girl dads. Um, they can show softness, but in the specific context of taking on a parental role and using it oftentimes to justify absolutely abhorrent behavior, like massacring an entire hospital full of, of doctors and the like, as he does in that show. Wolverine would do the same kind of thing, I'm sure.
Using women as a symbol, or girls even better because they're innocent, as a symbol of something that needs to be protected by that tough masculinity that then comes into play and saves everybody by killing everybody else.
Absolutely. Yeah. And which reminds me of, there have been um, a lot of instances in the comic book version of Wolverine where they reverse that, where Wolverine is captured near death. He's vulnerable. And it is his teenage girl sidekick who has to come to his rescue. I don't believe they've done the reverse in any of the on-screen versions. It would be, it would be interesting and new and provocative if they were to do that. But yeah, it's maybe that could happen in a movie like Deadpool, where there is some willingness to bend the rules of the genre.
I love that you're using that word of bending and expanding on what masculinity is, because oftentimes it's seen as so rigid and yet so fragile. It's like a glass box that men are put into, and they can't escape without gaining any type of retaliation from other men or even women or anybody else in the society who then feels weird about it because you're now stepping outside of your assigned role. You're crying, you're dancing, you're doing whatever that is not masculine enough. It's part of this greater trend right now that we have of reimagining what masculinity could be and finding new terms for it and new terms and conditions, really.
Yeah, no, that's terms and conditions is I think a really appropriate way to put it. Yeah, because it is like a contract that dictates thou shall do this, but not this, right? It really is like a legalese that we have internalized, and yeah, we're going to be punished if we step beyond it, um, unless you are able to see that it is just a script and unfortunately assume a lot of personal risk if you're going to do that, because in the same way that I know I'm going to get hate comments on my videos, um, I know that if I'm going to behave or conduct myself in a way other than what is typically masculine, I'm going to get side eye and comments and looks in the real world too. Unfortunately, as much as we talk about like, oh, be vulnerable and sensitive, you have to build up like a new kind of toughness and resilience there, because otherwise it's going to be too much for you in all likelihood, and you're going to run back to the safety of that fragile masculine box that you were describing. You're going to find a lot of men there who are very reassuring. Um, Whereas, outside of that box, you face the harassment of those men, but also the very warranted skepticism of women who aren't sure that they can trust what you're saying and doing.
Wolf in a lamb skin or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the wolf in sheep's clothes.
Yeah.
So until you can, prove yourself, uh, it can feel very lonely.
Yeah, and that's why I believe that it's important to show that men who show emotions are the brave ones and the strong ones, because we used to believe that the men who cry are weak, and they're not. They're so strong that not only are they able to face their own emotions, they are facing the reactions of other people around them who will call them a whole plethora of derogatory terms that are very demeaning and that usually have something to do with minorities. So you'll be compared with a woman or with a homosexual man or whatever, because they need to put you in your place. So if you're not acting as a strong white cis male, then you can't belong to them anymore, because the belongingness comes with those expectations of performing masculinity in some very toxic and harmful ways. When it comes to how you yourself try to battle that, I'm wondering, considering you're a feminist husband and a feminist dad, I personally say like just a dad who's doing his job as a dad and a husband who's doing his job as a husband. But we need that feminist at the front, because some people are still not there yet when it comes to changing the diapers. So how do you show up for your partner, for your children? How do you make sure that you're doing your best to be kind to yourself and to them?
Um, these are big questions. Yeah, to a large extent, it's pretty much second nature. I do though like to check in with my wife. We both of us, honestly, to say like, is there something that I need to be doing that I haven't? Even now, I'm like, I can hear my daughter is whining a little bit, and I'm trying to keep an ear out in case I'm called. Um, you're getting a lot of AOs over there. My daughter's in this funny phase where um, when she wants something, it seems she makes this noise where she goes AO 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 AO, and we call them the AOs. Um, it's like, oh, is she hungry? Is she just frustrated for some reason? Overtired, maybe. Um, but yeah, to get back to the question, um, honestly, it's listening and checking in, saying like what do you need? Am I doing what I need to be doing? I want to be careful to differentiate these kinds of conversations from the sorts that you hear about frequently on social media, where it's like, tell me what to do. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. It's not that. Because I'm going to give both of us enough credit to say that like we know what needs to be done. If we're running low on bottles for formula, then whoever has their hands free is going to claim them. If the baby is hungry, then uh, generally speaking, like either whoever's awake or whoever isn't busy is going to feed her. Same with diapers. Uh, but we also have to have the conversations about like the higher level stuff that makes us feel like cared for, especially in these times where, sometimes it feels like having a 6-week old saps all of your time and energy, and we need to make sure that we have some left over uh, to share with one another, and to do those little things. And that's where those check-ins become really valuable. And even with my older daughter, uh, she and I see a family counselor, especially with the arrival of this new baby, so that I can have a really good handle on what she's going through and what she's feeling and what she needs from me. But also so that I can say like, hey, this thing that you said or you did, um, like, hurt my feelings too, and we both need to be getting that feedback. I think the short answer to the question is a lot of it is just mindfulness, being mindful, being intentional, making clear that we want to be there for one another, and then figuring out how to do that in real life. How to turn that into concrete steps that we can take to support one another.
That's beautiful. I love how you show us both an example of actually taking care of your daughter, and the advice that you gave and the examples. I believe that will be helpful to some people to see that those types of behaviors are not given. Like, you have to put in effort into communication, into actively listening to your partner, to your children. It seems to me like you're not one of those people who believe their wife or children can talk back to them. So I believe that itself is a huge thing. So you're breaking some patterns with the way that you're communicating and working with your family. So that's beautiful.
Well, thank you.
I want to go back to the topic of popular culture for a bit.
Okay.
Where while I was preparing for this interview, I was binging your articles as one does. So I stumbled upon one from like 20 years ago almost now, when you were
Oh,
writing
wow.
about Lost. So did you rewatch Lost since it aired, and what are your thoughts on its representational issues?
I have not, no. So generally I don't rewatch TV shows, especially when the time commitment for a show like Lost would be considerable. Um, I have suggested to my older daughter uh, that I would at least rewatch the first few episodes with her because I have really vivid and positive memories of you know, sections of Lost. There are other parts of the series that I have no interest in revisiting, but I do remember, the pilot in the probably like the first 10 or 12 episodes. I remember them really fondly. Um, but also, do I want to risk going back and revisiting those memories? I don't know. Knowing what I know, knowing how it ends, do I want to do that?
My husband and I rewatched a few weeks ago, and yeah, it's tough when you rewatch stuff after you learned about representational issues or the way that some stereotypes come into play. And I mean, Saeed is the best example of it. It's so horrible, it's, well, gross. But women as well, I didn't even notice the first time when I was watching it how villainized motherhood is in some case, or it's just a plot conveyor. So most of the women go insane through the series because of motherhood in some way. So that was very weird. But on the other side, the otherness was done interestingly, and I believe that a lot of people don't even know that the reason they have any consciousness of the fact that there are other people is because of that show. So I think we have to give them credit for that, for educating a generation of people who were in the 2000s learning for the first time about that word and about post-colonialism in that sense. So
Sure.
so it's a very interesting type of, you know, uh, speaking with yourself about is it okay to watch this in 2024 or not. So that's why I asked.
Yeah, and I remember, if I'm remembering when I wrote that paper correctly, I think it was during the third season of the show. And so we didn't have a clear sense of even who the others on the island were and where they all came from at that point. Not that they cleared up a whole lot of what was going on with that island. Um, even when they would go into the distant past and it remained unclear where anybody came from. Um, I suppose that really it was just an island of people who were shipwrecked there at one point or another. The show was a mess, and one of they were clearly like making things up as they went along. I remember reading an article several years after the show had ended, where the showrunners admitted that they had to immediately start rewriting it because when the pilot aired, um, nearly everyone correctly guessed what the twist was going to be. And the twist was going to be that they were all dead, that the island was some sort of limbo from which they had to escape. And so they're like, well, can't do that. And then that's why in the final season, they have the flash sideways where everyone's in the afterlife. And they're like, that was our nod to the original concept. But yeah, they had to do so much rewriting. And actually, there was one thing that I remember them mentioning when the show was still in production that I think might have addressed one of the concerns that you raised, which is that the character of Jack, ostensibly our hero, our main character, was supposed to die in the pilot. He was supposed to be a red herring. We think he's being built up. as the center of the show, and they kill him off at the end of the second hour. And Kate was supposed to be the hero. And so when they made the decision to keep Jack around, they took a lot of the characteristics of Kate and handed them to Jack, so that like she was supposed to be the confident, and the reassuring, inspiring presence, who of course is a victim of their own hubris and has all of these flaws that we don't learn about until later. But no, instead that goes to exactly the sort of person that you would expect to find all of these qualities attached to.
That was that weird type of time in the Hollywood, because Matrix had the same problem. They wanted to give it to Divinity. She was supposed to be the one, but in the end, she just became somebody who unlocks the potential of the one true love, which is reinforcing every fairy tale we've had since the beginning of time of patriarchy.
Did you watch the most recent Matrix movie, the one from, I'm trying to remember the name, from a few years back?
I think so. I'm not sure, honestly.
We found out that they were like put back into the Matrix,
Mhm.
and they had forgotten who they were, and they had to find one another again. And so they came up with what I thought was a very clever twist here, which was to say that Neo was never the one. The two of them together are the one. That it was always both of them.
That's nice.
It's certainly an improvement over, yeah, you are a vehicle to help him recognize that he is the one.
Yeah. Do you have any recommendations for people watching this who would like to binge on something or listen to something or read something that would provide them with some great representation in media, or that would just be a great escape from all the horrible things that are happening right now? What are you watching?
What am I watching? Uh, it is a funny question right now, yeah, because I will frequently watch The Sopranos while I'm feeding the baby in the middle of the night, which is certainly no one's recommendation in terms of, good progressive representation, other than to say, hey, look, here is one of the most toxic masculine men on TV, and he's trying to go to therapy. I feel like if this show were to be made now, they would have him using this therapy in order to, very overtly weaponize it, the way that men in the manosphere do. They've been exposed to just enough therapy to know all of the right words to use in order to twist what they are saying, right? Oh man, what else have I been watching though? Like I would have to open apps to scroll through what's on my watch list, because it's a struggle to to remember in the moment. I do think, the one thing I will say is that the kinds um, of commentary on pop culture, on movies and TV that are available on platforms like TikTok and Instagram are really wonderful. And what I would encourage people to do is even to look on these platforms for people uh, who have the sorts of perspectives or interpretive lenses that resonate with them, and click follow, click like, so that then the algorithm will feed you more voices like those, because that sort of commentary is out there. Even to look at something like Star Wars properties, between like Andor and the Acolyte, and at least two of the three new sequels that came out recently. Um, you have some very interesting politics being inserted into what had been a very traditional sort of fairy tale story. Uh, and if you want that extra deep dive into um, the representation and really like in some cases some radical anarchist or revolutionary sort of stories being told, then it's quite easy to find people on these platforms who would joyfully share those conversations with you. The tricky part is finding them in the sea of much more questionable commentary, but they are out there.
Yeah, hopefully people will find them. This brings us to almost the end of the episode, so now is the moment for you to share any type of message, call for action.
Is there a closing remark or a call to action? Okay, maybe two short notes. One would be to encourage people who are willing and able to take on the risk to display this kind of vulnerability. If you've ever had an interest in starting your own TikTok or Instagram channel to share what you are into, the causes that are important to you, and to talk about them and find that community. There's no time like the present. Go out, do that, because it can be tremendously fulfilling. But barring that, if there are people that you already follow because you're on these apps, but mostly just as a passive observer, maybe as an occasional commenter, if there are people who are doing work that is important to you, let them know that too. Because far too often, I speak to people who don't feel, I think because they don't know, that they are doing good, that that they are having a positive impact, that they are reaching people. And it can make all the difference to hear from somebody that you have done something to to brighten their day or to make their life just a little bit better. It asks very little of us as as the audience or the commenter, but it can have a pretty profound impact on somebody.
I appreciate that. It gives power to everybody to then empower the people who want to do some great work to show them they are appreciated. Because more often than not, when people are leaving comments or reviews or whatever, they're only doing it when they're feeling wronged or when they want to share something bad. But when we believe in something positive, we sometimes forget to share it with others. And sometimes we need that balance.
Absolutely. Wonderful.
That will be all for this episode. Thank you so much, Neil, for being here.
Thank you.
It's a tough job that you do, juggling both your day job and your job as a social media creator. It's almost like a superhero type of situation, you know?
Yeah, it feels like a small overstatement, but I'll take it.
Well, it is. You have those double expectations of those different types of work, so you have to adjust, and it all comes with its own challenges, and there are some nemesis along the way. So, you know. But it's great work, really, and I'm so grateful to you for speaking to me today on your first day of summer break. I hope you'll spend it with your family and, you know, get some rest and get refreshed for fall, for a new batch of students who will be using TikTok phrases.
Yeah, and and who knows what generative AI will look like at that point too.
Oh, yeah. Looking forward to grading.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, grading is just getting more and more difficult, right? It's who knows what we can trust.
In the meantime, we have Deadpool and Wolverine movie.
You're right.
So
Yeah.
and that will be all for today's episode. Thank you, Neil, once again.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for sticking around for this bit longer episode. I just couldn't cut much of the things out because it was too interesting for me personally, not gonna lie. So if you enjoyed watching, make sure to leave a like and maybe even subscribe to miss on any future episodes. And also, here is a reminder that this is a safe space, so any type of violence or hate will not be tolerated, but you're more than welcome to share your own opinions, thoughts, and experiences in the comment section, as well as your favorite superheroes. I'll see you in some other episode. Bye!